My mother-in-law had no idea I was secretly paying $15,000 a month to keep a roof over her head. She looked me dead in the eye at Sunday dinner and ordered me to pack my bags so her golden child son could move his pregnant wife into my master suite. 2 days later, I called a luxury moving crew and gutted the entire Buckhead mansion down to the bare drywall. I took the smart home servers, the imported chandeliers, and every single appliance I had quietly purchased. But leaving them in an empty, echoing house was only the beginning of their nightmare. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled my in-laws' fake high society lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to show toxic family members exactly who holds the real power. My name is Sasha. I am 32 years old, and for 5 years I played the role of the quiet, obedient wife to my husband Darren. Darren was a mid-level banking manager who cared more about maintaining a wealthy facade for his mother than building an actual partnership with his wife. His mother, Geraldine, was the reigning queen of her local church building committee and an absolute terror in the Atlanta social scene. Geraldine was obsessed with optics' generational legacy and making sure everyone in her congregation knew her family lived in a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. What Geraldine and the rest of them did not know was that I was not just some struggling esthetician running a little lotion shop on the South Side. I was the founder and CEO of a highly lucrative chain of luxury medical spas across Georgia. My clinics offered advanced laser therapies, regenerative dermatology, and concierge wellness treatments for the true elite of Atlanta. We had a 6-month waiting list. My clients were the actual millionaires that my mother-in-law desperately pretended to be. Because I preferred understated clothes and letting my work speak for itself, they constantly mistook my humility for poverty. They assumed Darren was the breadwinner, rescuing a poor girl from obscurity. The tension had been brewing for months, but the final explosion happened on a warm Sunday afternoon. We were all gathered in the formal dining room of the Buckhead estate for Geraldine's mandatory post-church dinner. The spread was extravagant. Smothered pork chops, collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, and candied yams sat atop the massive imported Italian marble dining table. I had paid $22,000 for that exact table, a fact everyone conveniently chose to ignore. Geraldine sat at the head of the table, still wearing her elaborate lavender church hat, looking like a monarch presiding over her subjects. To her right sat Traven, Darren's older brother and the undisputed golden child of the family. Traven called himself a venture capitalist, though no one ever saw him actually work. He wore a flashy designer watch and spent the entire meal scrolling on his phone, ignoring the family completely. Next to him was his wife Kendra, who was newly pregnant and making sure absolutely everyone knew it. She had her hand resting dramatically on her barely visible baby bump, wearing a brightly colored silk dress that screamed for attention. And then there was Darren sitting next to me, shrinking into his chair as he always did when his mother held court. We were halfway through the meal when the atmosphere shifted abruptly. Geraldine forcefully pushed her china plate aside. The heavy clink against the marble silenced the room instantly. She wiped her mouth with a linen napkin, locked her eyes directly on me, and dropped the hammer. She stated that Trevon and Kendra were expecting a child and needed the master suite to properly build this family's legacy. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her face was dead serious. She told me I needed to pack my bags and be out of the house by Tuesday. Her voice was steady, dripping with a venom she usually reserved for private conversations, but now she was doing it right out in the open. She stated it had been 5 years since Darren and I got married, and I had not given her son an heir. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust and said I was just taking up space in her family's estate. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I turned my head to look at my husband. I expected Darren to stand up to defend his wife, to tell his mother she was crossing an unforgivable line. I waited for him to act like the man I married. Instead, Darren cowered. He lowered his eyes, picked up his silver fork, and intensely focused on cutting a piece of cornbread. He did not say a single word to defend me or our marriage. I watched his hands tremble slightly. This was the man who whispered in the dark about how much he loved me, how we would build an empire together. Yet in the harsh light of his mother's dining room, he was nothing more than a terrified little boy, afraid of Mommy's disapproval. His silence was the loudest sound in the room. It broke whatever remaining bond tethered me to him. If he could not protect me from an unprovoked eviction in my own home, he was no longer my husband. He was just a stranger taking up my time. The cowardly silence from my husband gave Kendra the opening she had been waiting for all afternoon. She leaned forward across the marble, a smug smirk stretching across her face. She rubbed her stomach again and delivered her own targeted insult. Kendra told me I could finally move back to the South Side where I truly belonged. She laughed a high grating sound and said that running a little lotion shop was never going to fit in with Darren's executive lifestyle anyway. She glanced at my simple tailored navy dress, dismissing it as cheap, simply because it lacked a giant flashy designer logo plastered across the chest. Kendra claimed the Buckhead estate was reserved for the true heirs of the family, and that a nail technician's daughter had no business sleeping in the master bedroom. Trevin chuckled at his wife's insult, raising his crystal glass of sweet tea, as if toasting my immediate eviction. Geraldine nodded in deep approval, her chest puffed out with pride at how thoroughly they were putting me in my place. They were entirely convinced that I was a helpless, penniless woman who relied exclusively on Darren's banking salary to survive. They fully expected me to break down, cry, and beg them to let me stay in the basement. They thought I would fight for a husband who would not even look me in the eye. They were entirely wrong. I did not shed a single tear. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of pure clarity. The woman who had tried for years to win their approval died right there at that dining table. I calmly reached up and removed the linen napkin from my lap. I tossed it onto the center of the table right next to the gravy boat. I pushed my heavy chair back and stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. I looked down at Kendra, meeting her smug gaze with a cold, terrifying calm. I asked her if my Southside roots did not fit the executive lifestyle. Why did they fit perfectly when I quietly paid for the catering at her extravagant wedding? I watched the color instantly drain from Kendra's face as I reminded her out loud that Traven's credit cards kept declining the week before the ceremony. I detailed exactly how Traven had called me crying in the parking lot of the country club, terrified that the vendors were packing up their trucks and walking off the job. I stated clearly for the whole table to hear that I had transferred $30,000 from my business account to save their pathetic charade from public humiliation. Traven's jaw dropped open. He had sworn Kendra to secrecy about that financial disaster, but I was entirely done keeping their dirty secrets to protect their fragile egos. Geraldine gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace, demanding that I show some respect in her house. I turned my gaze to my mother-in-law. I smiled a sharp, predatory smile. I told her I would absolutely leave. I promised her I would be completely out by Tuesday, just as she commanded, but I leaned in close, making sure every single person at that table heard my final words. I told them to remember this exact moment, because this house was going to be incredibly cold and empty without me. I grabbed my cashmere coat from the hallway closet and walked out the heavy front doors without looking back. As soon as I was sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my car, I did not call my mother to cry. I did not call a divorce lawyer to vent about my spineless husband. I immediately connected to my car's Bluetooth and dialed the private concierge number for my luxury logistics and moving team. I gave Marcus, the head of the firm, very specific instructions. I ordered a fleet of 5 commercial moving trucks to arrive at the Buckhead property at exactly 9 on Tuesday morning. I knew Darren would be at the bank pretending to be a big shot, Geraldine would be at her weekly church committee meeting, and Trevon and Kendra would be out shopping for baby clothes they absolutely could not afford. I told the logistics manager I was not just taking my personal clothes. I handed over a comprehensive inventory list. I instructed his best crew to remove the custom crystal chandeliers I had imported from Italy. They were to unbolt the massive marble dining table from the floor. I ordered them to strip the living room of the velvet sofas, the Persian rugs, and the antique mirrors. I told them to rip out the high-end smart home servers and security systems I had paid to install. I even instructed them to take the stainless steel double-door refrigerator, the commercial-grade oven, and the luxury washer and dryer units. I had the receipts for absolutely every single item in that house, proving I was the sole legal purchaser. I was going to leave them with bare walls, exposed wires, and an echoing, empty shell of a mansion. Because they were about to learn a very hard lesson about who actually funded their fake high society lifestyle. Darren parked his leased silver BMW in the circular driveway of the Buckhead estate, loosening his silk tie with a heavy sigh. He expected to walk into the guest bedroom and find me weeping into a pillow, begging for his forgiveness and asking how I could make amends with his mother. He pushed open the mahogany front doors, ready to deliver a rehearsed speech about respecting family hierarchy. Instead, he stepped into a cavernous void. The grand foyer, usually illuminated by the cascading crystal chandelier I imported from Milan, was completely dark. A single wire dangled from the ceiling. Darren blinked his shoes, clicking loudly against the bare hardwood floors. The antique Persian rugs were gone. He rushed into the formal dining room, his panic rising. The massive Italian marble table, the velvet dining chairs, the custom silk drapery, all of it had vanished. Even the smart home control panels had been unscrewed from the drywall, leaving gaping holes. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The caller ID flashed his mother's name. Darren answered, his voice trembling as he surveyed the barren kitchen where the commercial appliances used to sit. Geraldine shrieked into the receiver, making him pull the phone away. She demanded to know why the neighbors had called her to report 5 commercial moving trucks backing out of the estate. Geraldine screamed that she was hosting a crucial brunch for the church building committee on Thursday, and the house needed to look immaculate to maintain their prestigious reputation. Darren stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence, promising his furious mother he would fix whatever ridiculous tantrum I was throwing. He hung up the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs, and pulled up the location tracking app. He tracked my location to an exclusive, ultra-luxury high-rise right in the heart of Buckhead, a building known for housing athletes and real estate tycoons. Assuming I had rented a cheap room on a lower floor, using our joint emergency credit card, he barged past the lobby concierge by tailgating a resident. He rode the private elevator to the top floor, his face flushed with misplaced righteous anger. He pounded his fist against the double doors of the penthouse. I opened the door wearing a tailored silk lounger, holding a delicate cup of green tea, completely serene. Darren pushed his way inside, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second at the breathtaking floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline before his blind rage took over. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, shouting that I had completely lost my mind. He demanded that I call the moving company right this second and return his family's expensive furniture to the estate. He yelled that his mother had an important society brunch to host, and I was maliciously trying to humiliate the entire family because my fragile feelings were hurt over a simple housing arrangement. He called me ungrateful, insisting that I should be thanking them on my hands and knees for letting a simple esthetician live in such grandeur for 5 long years. He ordered me to stop playing childish games and fix the massive mess I made before Trevon and Kendra moved their baby boxes into the master suite. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or back away. I simply walked over to the sleek glass coffee table, picked up a thick manila folder, and pressed it firmly into his chest. Darren fumbled with the heavy folder, his arrogant scowl faltering as he ripped open the top flap. His eyes scanned the first printed page, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He was looking at the original deed transfer and the corporate registry for Horizon LLC. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the absolute stunning silence in the penthouse. I told him to look closely at the verified signatures at the very bottom of the page. Darren's eyes darted back and forth across the legal text, the blood rapidly draining from his face, as the reality of the official documents finally registered in his panicking brain. I set my teacup down on the counter and let the brutal truth annihilate his manufactured reality. I reminded him of a rainy Tuesday exactly 4 years ago, the day he sat in a bank manager's office sweating through his tailored suit because his golden child brother Trevon had lost $200,000 in a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. I watched Darren's knees buckle slightly as I recounted how he secretly put the family estate up for collateral to bail Trevon out, desperate to prevent Geraldine from finding out her favorite son was a con artist. I reminded him of the horrible day the bank sent the official foreclosure notice because Trayvon predictably defaulted on the monthly payments. Darren gasped for air, clutching the folder as if it were physically burning his hands. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a lethal, quiet whisper. I told him he did not save the family estate. I saved it. I explained that I used the massive profits from my highly successful medical spa franchise, the very same business his mother constantly degraded as a little lotion shop, to form a blind LLC and buy the house directly from the bank. I looked him dead in the eye and stated clearly that I was the sole legal owner of the property. I let that undeniable fact settle over him, watching the arrogant banking manager transform into a terrified broken fraud. I told him I was the one paying the $15,000 a month for the massive mortgage, the exorbitant property taxes, and the high-end neighborhood maintenance fees. I had paid every single dime out of my own pocket to keep a luxurious roof over his mother's head, while she insulted my clothes, criticized my background, and called me a barren failure in front of her high society friends. I crossed my arms, feeling the absolute power of standing firmly in my truth. I told Darren that since he sat quietly and chewed his cornbread while his mother evicted me from my own property to make room for his brother's baby, the charity era of our marriage was officially over. I pointed to the second document in the folder. It was a formal, legally binding commercial lease agreement. I informed him that his rent was exactly $15,000 and it was due on the first of the month. I smiled sweetly and reminded him that the first of the month was in exactly 4 days. Darren dropped the folder onto the floor, the stark white papers scattering across the plush rug. He grabbed his hair, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps of pure panic. He begged me to stop, insisting this had to be a cruel nightmare. He confessed what I already knew, admitting out loud that he had absolutely zero savings. He cried that he had drained his entire banking salary paying for luxury car leases, expensive country club dues, and designer gifts to keep up false appearances and make Geraldine proud of him. He reached out to grab my arm, pleading with me to cover the massive house payments just one more time so his mother would not discover he was completely broke and living a lie. I stepped back, utterly disgusted by his weakness. I told him he should have thought about his finances before he let Kendra tell me to move back to the south side. Darren pulled out his phone, his hands shaking violently, and opened his banking app. He planned to transfer the funds left in our joint emergency account to cover the upcoming rent. I pulled out my own phone, tapped the screen twice, and executed the final phase of my departure. I froze his access to all my financial accounts, revoking his privileges on every single credit card I had secretly been paying off for him. Darren stared at his screen as the red error messages popped up, locking him out of the wealth he had arrogantly taken for granted. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, realizing I had entirely severed his financial life support. I walked to the front door and opened it wide, gesturing for him to leave my penthouse immediately. I told him he had 4 days to find $15,000, or I would happily send the county sheriff to evict his mother, his brother, and his pregnant sister-in-law right in the middle of their precious Sunday dinner. Darren stumbled out into the hallway, his entire world shattered. Desperate, humiliated, and terrified of Geraldine discovering the shameful truth, Darren did not go back to the bank. A few hours later, he was seen pulling his leased BMW into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a shady, high-interest predatory loan office on Buford Highway, ready to sign his life away to sharks, just to pay his wife the rent. Darren signed his soul away on Buford Highway, desperately hoping the toxic high-interest loan would buy him enough time to fix his shattered reality. But the real nightmare was just beginning, back at the Buckhead estate. Tuesday morning arrived, and the timeline Geraldine had so arrogantly established was officially in motion. Trevin pulled his leased white Range Rover up the long, sweeping driveway, expecting to walk into the fully furnished, opulent mansion he felt he rightfully deserved. Kendra stepped out of the passenger seat, already complaining loudly about her swollen ankles. She was holding a ridiculous designer lapdog under one arm and carrying a cup of iced coffee in the other. They pushed open the grand double mahogany doors, completely ready to claim my master suite as their royal prize. Instead, they were greeted by the hollow, mocking echo of their own footsteps. The house was entirely stripped. Not a single lamp, not a single Persian rug, not even a decorative throw pillow remained. The bare drywall seemed to laugh at them. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows, completely stripped of their custom silk drapes, let in blinding sunlight that highlighted absolutely nothing but dust motes dancing in the empty air. Kendra dropped her designer handbag on the bare floorboards. The sharp smack echoed through the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that vibrated against the barren walls. She stormed frantically through the empty living room, the empty dining room, and charged up the curved staircase to the master suite. It was a completely hollow shell. The custom California king bed was gone. The imported vanity was gone. The walk-in closets were entirely bare. She whipped around and unleashed a hysterical fit of rage. She screamed at Darren, her voice cracking with fury, demanding to know where the imported Italian crib was. She yelled that Darren had explicitly promised her a fully furnished luxury nursery fit for the heir to the family legacy. She pointed her manicured finger at his chest, sobbing violently that she could not possibly bring a baby into a house that looked like an abandoned warehouse. Darren stood there paralyzed in the doorway, sweating heavily through his dress shirt, entirely unable to admit that he owned absolutely nothing in this house and that his wife had legally gutted the property. The hysterical screaming echoed through the empty vents and drew Geraldine from the guest wing, which was also completely devoid of furniture. She marched down the hallway, her face contorted in a mixture of total confusion and profound embarrassment. Geraldine demanded answers, her eyes darting wildly around the empty rooms, completely unwilling to accept the reality staring her in the face. She turned on Darren, her eyes blazing with that familiar toxic authority that had controlled him his entire life. She commanded him to fix the situation immediately. She told him that the family honor was at stake, and she would not allow her grandchild to be born into a house of squalor while the neighbors gossiped about their empty driveway. She did not ask how he would pay for it. She simply ordered him to make the nursery appear by the end of the week, threatening to expose his failures to the entire church congregation if he humiliated her further. Terrified of losing his mother's approval, Darren caved completely. He took the predatory loan he had just secured at an astronomical 40% interest rate and drove straight to an overpriced baby boutique in Phipps Plaza. He maxed out the shady funds, buying a ludicrously expensive mahogany crib, a matching changing table, a custom rocking chair, and absurd designer baby blankets. He thought he was saving face and buying his family's respect, but he was only digging his own grave much deeper. I knew all of this because I had eyes everywhere in the city, and Darren's pathetic desperation was incredibly predictable. The very next afternoon, I was sitting at a prime corner table at a highly exclusive French bistro in Buckhead Village. I was having a working lunch with a board of high society medical investors, finalizing a massive expansion plan for my medical spa franchise. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored beige suit with absolutely no loud logos, quietly discussing multi-million-dollar profit margins and real estate acquisitions. As I sipped my sparkling water, the heavy glass restaurant doors swung open and in walked Kendra. She was flanked by 3 of her equally loud, equally fake friends. Kendra was practically vibrating with desperate energy, parading around the restaurant with massive shopping bags from the luxury baby boutique. She wanted every single patron in the dining room to see how much money was supposedly being spent on her. She scanned the room and spotted me sitting quietly in the corner with my colleagues. Her eyes lit up with malicious glee. She saw an opportunity to establish her dominance in front of her friends and marched directly over to my table. She did not care that I was clearly in a professional meeting. She looked down her nose at my understated beige suit, letting out a loud theatrical sigh of pity. She announced to the entire dining area that it was such a terrible shame I had to move out of the estate and downgrade my life. She loudly suggested that if my little lotion shop ever went bankrupt, I could maybe come work as her housekeeper, since she was currently busy designing a $50,000 nursery for the true heir of the family. My investors looked at her in stunned silence, completely appalled by the sheer lack of class. But I did not blink. I smiled, a slow, calculated smile that made the air around our table drop 10 degrees. I stood up gracefully, smoothing the front of my jacket. I leaned in very close to Kendra, invading her personal space until she was forced to step back. I lowered my voice to a sharp surgical whisper meant only for her ears. I told her she needed to be very careful parading those shopping bags around the city. I explicitly detailed that the predatory loan Darren had just taken out at a massive 40% interest rate to buy that mahogany crib was tied directly to her husband's fake venture capital firm. I watched her smug expression shatter into a mask of pure terror as I casually mentioned that I had seen the banking ledgers. I whispered that Trevon did not have a single legitimate investment to his name. I told her that every single piece of designer clothing she was currently wearing and every baby blanket in those bags was funded by Darren's desperate loans and Trayvon's complete financial fraud. I stepped back, letting the brutal reality of my words sink into her brain. I wished her a lovely lunch, sat back down with my investors, and smoothly picked up the conversation right where we left off. Kendra stood there completely paralyzed, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped her expensive shopping bags. She turned pale white and practically ran out of the restaurant, leaving her confused friends scrambling to catch up. But putting Kendra in her place was only a minor satisfaction. The real work began the second I returned to my corporate office. I sat down at my massive glass desk and immediately called my lead forensic accountant. I told him to completely tear apart the financial structure of Trayvon's so-called venture capital firm. I wanted every transaction, every wire transfer, every hidden shell company, and every fake asset entirely exposed to the light. My team worked relentlessly through the night, tracing the complicated digital breadcrumbs of Trayvon's flashy lifestyle. They dug through public records, corporate filings, and anonymous bank transfers. By the next morning, my accountant walked into my office and placed a thick, terrifying financial report directly on my desk. What I found inside those pages was infinitely worse than a few declined credit cards or unpaid loans. Trayvon was not just a lazy fraud living off his brother's banking salary. He was running a highly illegal, highly destructive Ponzi scheme right under their noses. The financial records showed that he had been systematically targeting elderly members of Geraldine's own church congregation. He promised them massive returns on real estate developments that simply did not exist. He took their hard-earned money and used it to pay off earlier investors, keeping the massive excess to fund his own lavish existence. And the most shocking, devastating revelation of all was staring right at me in black and white ink. Trayvon had forged documents to gain power of attorney over his mother's finances. He had been secretly funneling Geraldine's entire pension and retirement fund into his fake company to pay for his luxury car leases, his expensive watches, and Kendra's endless designer shopping sprees. He was actively stealing the last pennies his own mother had to her name, leaving her completely destitute without her even knowing it. Geraldine's lifelong savings were completely gone, wiped out by the golden child son she worshipped unconditionally, and the entire fragile house of cards was about to violently collapse right on top of them. While my lead forensic accountant continued to secure the hard digital evidence of Trayvon's massive financial crimes and his theft of Geraldine's retirement fund, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly against the surface of my glass desk. The screen illuminated with a long, demanding message from Geraldine. It was not an apology for her horrific behavior at Sunday dinner. It was a highly detailed, aggressively worded invoice. The message was a strict demand for exactly $25,000. She commanded me to wire the funds immediately to an elite, highly sought-after Atlanta catering company to cover the artisan food, the imported champagne, and the custom floral arrangements for Kendra's upcoming baby shower. According to Geraldine's twisted logic, this astronomical sum was to serve as my required penance for stealing Darren's furniture and disrespecting the family's legacy. She typed out a massive, arrogant paragraph boasting about the sheer prestige of the upcoming event, declaring it the social highlight of the season. She made absolutely certain to emphasize that the guest list included the mayor's wife, the senior church officials, and the wealthiest, most influential wives in the entire Buckhead district. She ended the text by stating that if I paid this penance quickly and quietly, she might consider allowing me to attend the shower and sit in the back row to observe her family's triumph. The utter delusion was staggering to witness. Her golden child son had just secretly vaporized her entire life savings, yet she was still desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of high society dominance, demanding that the woman she had just violently evicted foot the bill for her vanity project. I did not type out a long emotional response to justify myself. I did not try to reason with her or explain that she was currently living in a house I legally owned. I simply replied with a single word. No. Less than 2 hours after I sent that single-word response, the sleek frosted glass doors of my flagship medical spa slid open. Darren walked into the reception area panting heavily, his silk tie askew and his expensive suit jacket severely wrinkled. He had clearly rushed over straight from his office at the bank, likely dispatched by his furious mother the very moment my text was delivered. But as he stepped onto the pristine white marble floors of the clinic, his aggressive momentum completely evaporated. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting wildly around the massive state of the art facility. This was not the little Southside lotion shop his mother and sister-in-law constantly mocked at family gatherings. He was standing inside a multi-million-dollar clinical sanctuary that practically hummed with quiet, exclusive wealth. A massive waterfall wall cascaded gently behind a brushed gold reception desk, where 3 impeccably dressed receptionists managed a bank of ringing phones. To his left, elite clients carrying Birkin bags and wearing oversized designer sunglasses sat in plush white leather waiting chairs. They sipped cucumber water and read luxury magazines while awaiting highly expensive laser treatments, advanced injectables, and regenerative therapies. Darren stared at the glowing gold letters spelling out my name on the marble wall above the desk. He swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray, as the reality of my actual success finally crashed down on him. He had spent 5 long years treating me like a financial burden, completely blind to the massive corporate empire I was quietly building, while he drained his own bank accounts trying to impress his mother. My head of security, a towering former police officer named Marcus, immediately stepped into Darren's path as he tried to approach the desk. I caught Marcus's eye from across the room and gave a subtle, controlling nod. I walked out from my private corner office, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I crossed my arms and stared coldly at the trembling man I used to call my husband. Darren practically ran over to me, his hands shaking as he begged me to step into my private office so we could talk away from the staring eyes of my wealthy clients. I absolutely refused. I told him he had exactly 2 minutes to speak his mind right there in the open lobby. He lowered his voice to a frantic, desperate whisper, the panic radiating off his skin. He begged me to just wire the $25,000 to the catering company for Kendra's baby shower. He admitted that the brutal, high-interest loan he took out on Buford Highway to buy the nursery furniture was from a dangerous group of predatory lenders. He was sweating profusely, confessing that the loan sharks were already calling his direct office line at the bank, threatening to expose his massive debts to his branch manager. If his boss found out he was associating with back-alley lenders and defaulting on payments, he would be immediately terminated, losing the only legitimate source of income left in his entire family. He pleaded with me using my old pet names, asking me to save him just one more time so his mother could have her perfect society event, and the loan sharks would back off. I looked at his terrified, sweating face and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual love, no desire to save him. Just cold, clinical clarity. I stepped closer to him, my voice perfectly calm, but loud enough for my receptionists and the waiting clients to hear every single word. I reminded him of the exact moment my love for him permanently died. I told him that he sat at that massive dining table and watched his mother call me a barren failure in front of his arrogant brother and his smug sister-in-law. I reminded him that he watched his family laugh as they kicked me out of my own home, and instead of defending his wife, he simply looked down, picked up his fork, and chewed his cornbread like a coward. I looked him dead in the eye and stated that he did not get my financial or emotional protection anymore. I told him that his mother's endless vanity, his brother's massive financial fraud, and his own crippling inability to stand up for his wife were no longer my problems to solve. I signaled to Marcus, who stepped forward and firmly placed a heavy hand on Darren's shoulder, guiding him toward the automatic exit doors. Darren stumbled backward, his face crumbling into absolute despair as he realized that the quiet, obedient woman he had relied on for financial salvation was gone forever. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind him, cutting off his pathetic, whimpering apologies. I turned around and walked confidently back into my private office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I sat down in my leather executive chair and took a deep breath, letting the quiet power of the room wash over me. Before I could even open my email to review the morning reports, a sharp, urgent ping echoed from my desktop computer speakers. It was a high-priority automated alert from the secure property management portal I used to handle the Buckhead Estates leasing agreements. I clicked on the flashing red icon, my eyes scanning the brief clinical text. The notification was absolutely devastating for Darren's future. His rent check for $15,000 had officially bounced due to insufficient funds. The bank had forcefully rejected the transfer, meaning Darren had entirely failed to cover the lease on the house his family was currently squatting in. I stared at the screen, a genuine, brilliant smile spreading across my face. According to strict Georgia property laws, a bounced rent check on a commercial lease agreement allowed me to bypass standard waiting periods and file an immediate notice to vacate. I pulled up the digital calendar on my second monitor and began calculating the mandatory legal timeline for the eviction process. I counted the days forward, factoring in the upcoming weekend and the standard court processing times for the county. My finger traced the digital squares until it landed on the exact date the county sheriffs would be legally authorized to execute the writ of possession and physically remove the occupants and their belongings from the property. I started laughing, a deep, resonant sound of pure, unadulterated victory echoing in my office. The legal eviction date landed precisely on the exact same Saturday afternoon that Geraldine was hosting Kendra's lavish, extravagant baby shower. The trap was perfectly set, and they were about to walk right into it in front of the entire city. Darren signed his soul away on Buford Highway, desperately hoping the toxic high-interest loan would buy him enough time to fix his shattered reality. But the real nightmare was just beginning back at the Buckhead estate. Tuesday morning arrived, and the timeline Geraldine had so arrogantly established was officially in motion. Traven pulled his leased white Range Rover up the long, sweeping driveway, expecting to walk into the fully furnished, opulent mansion he felt he rightfully deserved. Kendra stepped out of the passenger seat, already complaining loudly about her swollen ankles. She was holding a ridiculous designer lapdog in one arm and carrying a cup of iced coffee in the other. They pushed open the grand double mahogany doors, completely ready to claim my master suite as their royal prize. Instead, they were greeted by the hollow, mocking echo of their own footsteps. The house was entirely stripped. Not a single lamp, not a single Persian rug, not even a decorative throw pillow remained. The bare drywall seemed to laugh at them. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows, completely stripped of their custom silk drapes, let in blinding sunlight that highlighted absolutely nothing but dust motes dancing in the empty air. Kendra dropped her designer handbag on the bare floorboards. The sharp smack echoed through the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that vibrated against the barren walls. She stormed frantically through the empty living room, the empty dining room, and charged up the curved staircase to the master suite. It was a completely hollow shell. The custom California king bed was gone. The imported vanity was gone. The walk-in closets were entirely bare. She whipped around and unleashed a hysterical fit of rage. She screamed at Darren, her voice cracking with fury, demanding to know where the imported Italian crib was. She yelled that Darren had explicitly promised her a fully furnished luxury nursery fit for the heir to the family legacy. She pointed her manicured finger at his chest, sobbing violently that she could not possibly bring a baby into a house that looked like an abandoned warehouse. Darren stood there paralyzed in the doorway, sweating heavily through his dress shirt, entirely unable to admit that he owned absolutely nothing in this house, and that his wife had legally gutted the property. The hysterical screaming echoed through the empty vents and drew Geraldine from the guest wing, which was also completely devoid of furniture. She marched down the hallway, her face contorted in a mixture of total confusion and profound embarrassment. Geraldine demanded answers, her eyes darting wildly around the empty rooms, completely unwilling to accept the reality staring her in the face. She turned on Darren, her eyes blazing with that familiar, toxic authority that had controlled him his entire life. She commanded him to fix the situation immediately. She told him that the family honor was at stake, and she would not allow her grandchild to be born into a house of squalor while the neighbors gossiped about their empty driveway. She did not ask how he would pay for it. She simply ordered him to make the nursery appear by the end of the week, threatening to expose his failures to the entire church congregation if he humiliated her further. Terrified of losing his mother's approval, Darren caved completely. He took the predatory loan he had just secured at an astronomical 40% interest rate and drove straight to an overpriced baby boutique in Phipps Plaza. He maxed out the shady funds buying a ludicrously expensive mahogany crib, a matching changing table, a custom rocking chair, and absurd designer baby blankets. He thought he was saving face and buying his family's respect, but he was only digging his own grave much deeper. I knew all of this because I had eyes everywhere in the city, and Darren's pathetic desperation was incredibly predictable. The very next afternoon, I was sitting at a prime corner table at a highly exclusive French bistro in Buckhead Village. I was having a working lunch with a board of high society medical investors, finalizing a massive expansion plan for my medical spa franchise. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored beige suit with absolutely no loud logos, quietly discussing multi-million-dollar profit margins and real estate acquisitions. As I sipped my sparkling water, the heavy glass restaurant doors swung open and in walked Kendra. She was flanked by three of her equally loud, equally fake friends. Kendra was practically vibrating with desperate energy, parading around the restaurant with massive shopping bags from the luxury baby boutique. She wanted every single patron in the dining room to see how much money was supposedly being spent on her. She scanned the room and spotted me sitting quietly in the corner with my colleagues. Her eyes lit up with malicious glee. She saw an opportunity to establish her dominance in front of her friends and marched directly over to my table. She did not care that I was clearly in a professional meeting. She looked down her nose at my understated beige suit, letting out a loud theatrical sigh of pity. She announced to the entire dining area that it was such a terrible shame I had to move out of the estate and downgrade my life. She loudly suggested that if my little lotion shop ever went bankrupt, I could maybe come work as her housekeeper since she was currently busy designing a $50,000 nursery for the true heir of the family. My investors looked at her in stunned silence, completely appalled by the sheer lack of class. But I did not blink. I smiled a slow, calculated smile that made the air around our table drop 10 degrees. I stood up gracefully, smoothing the front of my jacket. I leaned in very close to Kendra, invading her personal space, until she was forced to step back. I lowered my voice to a sharp, surgical whisper meant only for her ears. I told her she needed to be very careful parading those shopping bags around the city. I explicitly detailed that the predatory loan Darren had just taken out at a massive 40% interest rate To buy that mahogany crib was tied directly to her husband's fake venture capital firm. I watched her smug expression shatter into a mask of pure terror as I casually mentioned that I had seen the banking ledgers. I whispered that Trayvon did not have a single legitimate investment to his name. I told her that every single piece of designer clothing she was currently wearing and every baby blanket in those bags was funded by Darren's desperate loans and Trayvon's complete financial fraud. I stepped back, letting the brutal reality of my words sink into her brain. I wished her a lovely lunch, sat back down with my investors, and smoothly picked up the conversation right where we left off. Kendra stood there completely paralyzed, her hands trembling so violently, she nearly dropped her expensive shopping bags. She turned pale white and practically ran out of the restaurant, leaving her confused friends scrambling to catch up. But putting Kendra in her place was only a minor satisfaction. The real work began the second I returned to my corporate office. I sat down at my massive glass desk and immediately called my lead forensic accountant. I told him to completely tear apart the financial structure of Trayvon's so-called venture capital firm. I wanted every transaction, every wire transfer, every hidden shell company, and every fake asset entirely exposed to the light. My team worked relentlessly through the night, tracing the complicated digital breadcrumbs of Trayvon's flashy lifestyle. They dug through public records, corporate filings, and anonymous bank transfers. By the next morning, my accountant walked into my office and placed a thick, terrifying financial report directly on my desk. What I found inside those pages was infinitely worse than a few declined credit cards or unpaid loans. Trayvon was not just a lazy fraud living off his brother's banking salary. He was running a highly illegal, highly destructive Ponzi scheme right under their noses. The financial records showed that he had been systematically targeting elderly members of Geraldine's own church congregation. He promised them massive returns on real estate developments that simply did not exist. He took their hard-earned money and used it to pay off earlier investors, keeping the massive excess to fund his own lavish existence. And the most shocking, devastating revelation of all was staring right at me in black and white ink. Trayvon had forged documents to gain power of attorney over his mother's finances. He had been secretly funneling Geraldine's entire pension and retirement fund into his fake company to pay for his luxury car leases, his expensive watches, and Kendra's endless designer shopping sprees. He actively stole all her savings, wiping out the golden child myth once and for all. I stepped into the aggressively cooled sanctuary of an exclusive boutique inside Phipps Plaza. The polished marble floors gleamed under the soft, recessed lighting. The scent of expensive leather hung heavily in the air. I was there for a final fitting on a bespoke silk suit. My medical spa empire was expanding into 3 new states rapidly. My wardrobe needed to reflect the absolute summit of corporate dominance. The sales associate, Julian, was carefully pinning the hem of my trousers. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was violently shattered. The heavy glass doors swung open, and in walked Kendra and Geraldine immediately. They were a walking spectacle of manufactured wealth and sheer arrogance. Kendra waddled forward, her pregnant belly leading the way, dripping in obnoxious logos. Geraldine flanked her, looking ridiculous in a loud floral dress. They were speaking at a volume entirely inappropriate for the serene environment. They loudly discussed thread counts and imported caviar. Julian subtly rolled his eyes, keeping his focus on my hemline. I remained perfectly still, watching them through the massive gilded mirror covering the wall. Kendra spotted my reflection instantly. Her eyes lit up with that familiar toxic excitement. She quickly nudged Geraldine to look around. They changed their trajectory, marching straight toward my private fitting area. Kendra was practically salivating at the opportunity to publicly humiliate me again. She was completely oblivious to the brutal financial trap I had set. Kendra stopped right at the edge of my fitting pedestal immediately. She crossed her arms over her designer maternity shirt with attitude. She looked me up and down with an exaggerated expression of pity. She projected her voice so every single wealthy patron could hear. She loudly announced that it was a tragic shame I was forced to buy boring business clothes right now entirely. She bragged that she was busy planning the most spectacular social event. Geraldine chimed in, elevating her chin and declaring their massive superiority. She stated Kendra's upcoming baby shower would cost $100,000. Geraldine bragged that the mayor's wife had already RSVP'd for it. She mentioned the top brass of the church building committee was coming. Kendra sneered, adding that the event would feature a live string quartet. She boasted about imported white truffles and a custom floral wall. She tilted her head, her voice dripping with venom, and asked me a highly insulting question very loudly today. She asked if I was struggling to pay for my simple suit. She laughed that Darren was no longer financing my pathetic little life. She stated that maybe if I saved my pennies, I could afford gifts. She seriously doubted my taste level could ever match her registry demands. Julian stiffened his hands, hovering over my ankles, clearly shocked by them. I did not react to her completely childish and desperate verbal attacks. I simply looked down at Kendra from my elevated position on the pedestal. My face remained a mask of absolute chilling calm as I stared completely silently. I stepped down from the pedestal, waving Julian away with my hand. I walked toward the front of the boutique with purposeful, slow steps. A massive limited edition designer baby stroller sat on a display platform. It was a ridiculous contraption covered in dark leather and gold hardware. It carried a massive price tag of exactly $5,000. Kendra followed me, her eyes locked onto the highly expensive baby stroller. She loudly declared to Geraldine that it was the absolute perfect carriage. She said it was exactly what the new family heir rightfully deserved to ride inside right now. She snapped her fingers at a nearby sales associate, demanding immediate service. She marched up to the brass payment counter with total arrogant entitlement. She pulled a heavy leather wallet from her massive, brightly colored handbag. She retrieved a sleek platinum credit card and slapped it down hard. The associate politely swiped the card through the main payment processing terminal. The terminal beeped a sharp, harsh tone that echoed through the room. Declined. Kendra scowled, snatching the card back and loudly blaming the bank network. She blamed a security hold for the highly embarrassing and public financial failure right there. She dug into her wallet and produced a second shiny credit card. She swiped it herself this time, glaring at the polite sales associate. Another harsh beep echoed through the quiet boutique a moment later. The card was declined. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead almost instantly. Geraldine shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the boutique in total panic. Other wealthy patrons began to openly stare at the humiliating scene unfolding. Kendra pulled out a third card, her hands shaking slightly with fear. She jammed it into the chip reader with force. The screen blinked red. Declined. The sales associate offered a tight, sympathetic smile to the furious women. He quietly suggested she contact her financial institution to resolve the issue. Kendra's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson, the humiliation radiating outward. Geraldine clutched her handbag, whispering frantically to Kendra to try another account. She was terrified of the public embarrassment unfolding in front of Atlanta's elite. Kendra frantically dug through her wallet, but there were no more cards. The silence in the boutique was absolutely deafening as they stood paralyzed. I walked smoothly to the counter, coming to stand directly beside Kendra very quickly. I placed my custom-tailored suit jacket and 3 silk blouses down softly. I added the trousers Julian had just finished pinning onto the glass. The associate quickly tallied my total, the screen flashing the massive sum. It was exactly $10,400 for my new wardrobe. I casually reached into my pocket and retrieved my solid metal card. I tapped my black card lightly against the payment terminal sensor pad. A soft, pleasant chime echoed through the quiet room almost immediately afterward. Approved. The associate smiled brightly, thanking me for my continued business and loyal support today. He promised to have the tailored pieces delivered directly to my penthouse. I turned to look directly at the freezing Kendra and panicked Geraldine. Their faces were completely drained of color as they stared at me. The arrogant sneers had vanished, replaced by shock and sheer absolute panic. They were staring at my black card, their brains struggling to comprehend reality. The woman they had constantly degraded was effortlessly dropping $10,000. Meanwhile, they could not even clear a single transaction for a baby stroller. I slowly picked up my receipt, folding it neatly and smiling at them warmly. I stepped closer to Kendra, my eyes dropping to her oversized bag. I stared directly at the bag, letting a sharp, dangerous smile fully form. I kept my voice low, ensuring only Kendra and Geraldine could hear me. I was about to unleash absolute devastation on their completely fake reality. I told Kendra that she really needed to pay closer attention immediately. I casually pointed out that the stitching on her handle was terribly frayed. I said her supposed Birkin bag was completely uneven and clearly very fake. I leaned in my voice, dropping to a lethal whisper for them. I told her that her fake bag was much like her husband. I said his bank accounts were entirely fraudulent and rapidly falling apart. Kendra gasped, instinctively pulling the fake bag behind her back in shame. I did not stop delivering the brutal truth to her terrified face. I asked her if Trayvon had bothered to tell her the absolute reality. I watched her pupils dilate with pure terror as I revealed verified facts. I told her the exact figures my forensic accountant had just uncovered entirely. I stated Trayvon's glorious crypto venture capital company was completely empty right now. I told her it had a current operating balance of $42. I watched Geraldine physically stumble backward, her hand flying to her chest. I stated clearly that there were no hidden investments or secret offshore accounts. I told Kendra that the only reason her cards were declining was Trayvon. He had already drained every single penny from his completely fraudulent business schemes. He blew it all on keeping up his pathetic manufactured image every single day. Panicked Kendra grabbed my arm and forcefully pulled me toward the boutique restroom. She dragged me inside the marble bathroom, locking it. She burst into tears, begging me not to tell Geraldine the truth. She sobbed that Geraldine would kill them if she knew they were broke. In her frantic, hysterical state, Kendra completely lost control of her own words. She accidentally slipped up, screaming wildly while pulling at her own hair. She cried that Trayvon absolutely could not be broke under any circumstances. She screamed that if he was broke, her real baby daddy would attack. She wailed the real father would completely expose them for child support. I smiled quietly, my smartwatch secretly recording every single word she just confessed. I left Kendra hyperventilating in the marble bathroom of the luxury boutique, the digital audio file of her frantic confessions safely secured on my encrypted cloud server. The sheer panic in her voice regarding her real baby daddy was the ultimate insurance policy, but I had absolutely no intention of deploying that nuclear option just yet. I stepped out into the blinding Atlanta afternoon sun, slipping on my dark sunglasses as my phone vibrated rapidly in my pocket. It was a discreet, highly urgent text message from Martha, the long-suffering administrative secretary at First Fellowship Cathedral. Martha and I had formed a quiet, powerful alliance over the past 5 years. She deeply despised Geraldine's tyrannical grip on the church's social committees, and I had secretly paid for her daughter's extensive dental surgery 2 years ago when the Church Benevolent Fund conveniently denied her application. Martha's text was frantic. She warned me that Geraldine had hastily convened a special emergency session of the Church Board of Elders. Geraldine was currently standing in the main sanctuary, actively weaponizing her crocodile tears to destroy my reputation before the brutal truth about her sons could leak to the congregation. She was spinning a wildly fabricated tale of my supposed mental breakdown, claiming I was a vindictive, money-hungry gold digger who had maliciously gutted Darren's home, stolen his prized heirlooms, and abandoned her fragile, heartbroken son. I immediately redirected my driver to the massive cathedral. Geraldine was desperately trying to control the narrative, attempting to isolate me from my community and paint herself as the pious, long-suffering matriarch victimized by a cruel daughter-in-law. She relied entirely on the fact that I usually kept my head down to keep the peace. She vastly underestimated my brand-new, unshakable resolve right now. I pushed open the heavy arched oak doors of the cathedral sanctuary exactly as Geraldine reached the highly dramatic climax of her completely fabricated sob story. The cavernous room was bathed in the colorful afternoon light filtering through the massive stained glass windows along the eastern wall. 12 elder board members sat in the front pews, their faces etched with deep, practiced sympathy as they listened intently to Geraldine's lies. She stood at the carved wooden podium, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief to her chest, putting on a performance worthy of a daytime television broadcast. She wailed loudly that I had completely lost my mind, aggressively accusing me of hiring dangerous thugs to violently clear out their beloved family estate, simply because I was maliciously jealous of Kendra's newly blessed pregnancy. She cried that Darren was currently weeping in his completely empty bedroom, a total lie, considering Darren was actually hiding from predatory loan sharks inside his banking office. She begged the elders for their continued spiritual prayers and asked them to formally excommunicate me from the entire congregation to protect the church's holy reputation from my highly toxic money-digging presence. My expensive high heels clicked sharply against the polished stone aisle, cutting straight through her theatrical weeping with a sharp, undeniable rhythm. Every single head in the massive sanctuary snapped quickly toward the back of the silent room. The board members looked entirely shocked to see the supposed villain casually strolling down the center aisle, looking flawlessly composed in my brand new bespoke suit. Geraldine gripped the wooden edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Her fake tears vanished instantly, immediately replaced by a look of absolute venomous hatred. She glared down at me from her elevated position, her chest heaving with furious indignation. I stopped right at the front of the altar, looking up at her with a perfectly serene smile on my face. I politely asked if I was interrupting a holy prayer circle, or just the local creative writing workshop. Geraldine's face contorted into a hideous mask of pure rage. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face and turned to Pastor Evans, who was sitting adjacent to the altar looking incredibly uncomfortable. She loudly commanded the pastor to have me escorted off the church premises immediately. She shrieked that this was an elite closed-door administrative meeting explicitly and strictly reserved for top-tier financial donors and legacy family members only. She yelled that a lowly esthetician with zero ties to the community and a recent history of malicious theft had absolutely no right to step foot in this sacred administrative space. I did not flinch or break eye contact with her. I simply reminded her of the time she cornered me at the annual church bake sale exactly 3 years ago. I reminded her how she loudly mocked my simple clothing in front of these exact same elders, telling everyone that Darren had to provide me with a weekly allowance just so I could afford to buy groceries. I reminded her how she patted my arm condescendingly and told me that perhaps one day my little hobby business would generate enough profit to buy a single brick for the new youth wing. I watched Pastor Evans shift nervously in his seat as the highly uncomfortable memory vividly surfaced in the quiet sanctuary. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out a thick leather-bound financial portfolio. I held it up high so the entire room could clearly see it right now, smiling very softly today. I walked straight up the altar steps, completely ignoring Geraldine's frantic demands for security, and handed the heavy portfolio directly to Pastor Evans. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the acoustics of the sanctuary carry my words to the back row. I stated clearly that I firmly believed the Platinum Anonymous donor, who fully funded the entire multi-million-dollar Youth Wing project, had an absolute right to sit in on any administrative meeting she chose. The sanctuary went completely dead silent. Geraldine let out a sharp, derisive scoff, loudly declaring that I was completely delusional and suffering from severe psychological distress. She insisted I was trying to take credit for the anonymous blessings of a truly wealthy, pious benefactor. Pastor Evans opened the leather portfolio, his eyes scanning the first page of the verified banking documents and the official corporate matching receipts. His jaw physically dropped. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his face draining of all color as the undeniable financial truth registered in his brain. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute astonishment, and then he looked out at the bewildered board of elders. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke into his lapel microphone. He announced to the entire stunned room that the documents were fully verified and entirely legitimate. He formally declared that Sasha was not just a donor, but the sole platinum anonymous benefactor who had single-handedly saved the church from bankruptcy and fully financed the entire new youth recreation center. He stated that I was the biggest financial benefactor in the entire history of First Fellowship Cathedral. Everyone in the sanctuary stopped breathing, their eyes darting back and forth between my calm face and Geraldine's absolutely horrified, utterly destroyed expression today. The collective gasp from the 12 elders echoed loudly through the vaulted ceilings. They instantly turned their collective gaze away from me and locked onto Geraldine, their expressions rapidly shifting from sympathetic support to absolute disgusted outrage. The board president stood up immediately, slamming his hand down on the wooden pew. He loudly admonished Geraldine for her blatant unchristian slander and her malicious attempt to weaponize the church against their most vital savior. Without hesitation, the board voted right there on the spot, formally stripping Geraldine of her highly coveted committee chair position and revoking her elite status within the congregation due to her appalling, deceitful behavior. Geraldine stood frozen at the podium, her entire social identity completely annihilated in less than 5 minutes. Humiliated, disgraced, and utterly exposed, she grabbed her purse and scrambled down the altar steps in a furious, clumsy retreat. As she barged past me, she hissed under her breath, violently swearing that she would completely destroy my life at Kendra's baby shower this coming Saturday. I simply smiled, pulled out my smartphone, and opened my messages. I calmly typed a quick text to the county sheriff's department, officially confirming the exact time for the scheduled eviction on Saturday afternoon. This eviction was perfectly aligned to ruin everything she had planned. The trap was absolutely flawless, and I was going to enjoy every single second of her ultimate destruction when the sheriffs arrived to legally throw them out onto the street during her precious party. The golden child's legacy was about to burn completely down to the ground. My revenge was finally reaching its brilliant, devastating conclusion, and I felt nothing but absolute power coursing through my veins as I walked gracefully out of the cathedral doors into the absolutely warm, bright, and clear sunlight today. That brilliant Friday afternoon faded into a deep, velvety twilight as I returned to my secure, multi-level penthouse in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. The sprawling city skyline glittered beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting the quiet, untouchable empire I had painstakingly built, while my former in-laws completely destroyed their own lives. I stepped out of my heels and poured myself a generous glass of imported Cabernet, letting the rich, complex flavors settle my adrenaline. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow was the exact day Kendra and Geraldine planned to host the most extravagant, utterly fraudulent baby shower in Buckhead history. Tomorrow was also the precise day the county sheriffs would forcefully execute the commercial eviction on that stripped-down estate. The trap was perfectly primed, and all I had to do was wait for the sun to rise. I took another slow sip of my wine, savoring the absolute silence of my private sanctuary. Suddenly, a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from my solid oak front door. My concierge always announced guests, meaning whoever was outside, had intentionally slipped past the security desk, likely tailgating a wealthy resident through the private garage elevator banks. I walked calmly toward the foyer, glancing at the high-definition security monitor mounted on the wall. Trayvon was standing in the hallway. He looked absolutely deranged. His designer silk shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, and his chest was heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. He pounded on the thick wood again, his heavy rings scraping violently against the polished surface. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt entirely in control. I pressed the secure intercom button, my voice echoing clearly into the hallway. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to state his business before I summoned the police to arrest him for trespassing. Trayvon yelled at the camera, his voice cracking with pure desperation, begging me to open the door. He swore he just needed to talk, claiming it was a matter of life and death for the entire family. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open, keeping a firm grip on the handle. Traven forcefully pushed his way inside his large frame, invading my pristine entryway. He practically vibrated with toxic masculine aggression. He completely abandoned the smooth, charming veneer he always wore at family dinners. The golden boy was completely unraveling right now. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, attempting to use his height and physical presence to intimidate me. He glared down at me, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched under his skin. He demanded that I wire exactly $50,000 into his personal checking account immediately. He did not ask. He commanded. He hissed that my malicious interference at the boutique today had completely ruined Kendra, claiming she was currently having a hysterical breakdown because her credit cards were frozen. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, threatening me with sheer violence. He snarled that if I did not transfer the $50,000 right this second, he would make a single phone call and hire a crew of heavily armed thugs to completely trash my flagship medical spas. He swore they would smash every single imported laser machine, shatter the glass storefronts, and burn my entire multi-million-dollar business to the ground. He breathed heavily, trying to project total dominance, fully expecting me to cower, cry, and instantly submit to his terrifying extortion demands. I stood my ground, perfectly rigid and relaxed at the exact same time. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not lower my gaze. I looked at his sweating, panicked face and felt absolutely nothing but clinical amusement. I turned my back on him completely, a deliberate display of utter disrespect, and walked slowly over to the marble kitchen island. I picked up my crystal wine glass and took another measured, elegant sip of the expensive Cabernet. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stand awkwardly in my foyer while his threats evaporated into the cool, air-conditioned air. I turned back around, leaning comfortably against the cool marble counter. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed brightly through the penthouse. "You think you are the first broke man with a bruised ego to threaten me?" I asked, my voice dripping with absolute lethal mockery. I told him he was nothing but a pathetic, desperate little boy wearing a leased suit he could no longer afford to dry clean. I watched his face flush a deep, furious crimson. I took a slow step toward him, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. I told him he was not going to hire any thugs to smash my spas because he did not even have enough money to buy a fast food hamburger. Trevin opened his mouth to scream another threat, but I cut him off immediately. I did not let him breathe. I unleashed the full weight of the financial devastation my forensic team had meticulously uncovered. I told him I knew exactly how he funded his fake venture capital firm. I looked him dead in the eye and recited the specific, exact names of the vulnerable elderly church members he had systematically defrauded. I listed Mr. Henderson, whose life savings Trayvon vaporized in a fake commercial development scheme. I named Mrs. Gable, a widow who trusted Trayvon with her late husband's entire pension, only to watch it vanish into his offshore shell companies. I recited the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts he stole from the congregation. Trayvon stumbled backward, his entire body shaking violently as the reality of his massive Ponzi scheme was laid completely bare in front of him. He grabbed the entryway table to steady himself, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I stepped even closer, driving the final, most agonizing nail directly into his coffin. I told him I also knew about his most disgusting betrayal. I stated clearly that I saw the forged power of attorney documents. I told him I knew he had completely drained Geraldine's retirement fund to pay for his luxury car leases and his wife's fake designer bags. I watched the last shred of his arrogant bravado shatter into a million jagged pieces. Despite being entirely exposed as a criminal and a fraud, Trayvon's toxic arrogance flared up for one final desperate defense. He sneered at me, a highly ugly, twisted expression contorting his sweating face. He puffed out his chest, trying to salvage any remaining dignity. He stated that I was wasting my breath entirely. He laughed mockingly, declaring that Geraldine would never under any circumstances believe a vindictive ex-wife over her precious golden boy. He boasted that he could spin any financial discrepancy into a temporary banking error. He claimed his mother was so deeply blinded by her love for him that she would gladly hand over her last dime if he simply smiled and asked for it. He confidently declared that the church elders would never press charges because the resulting scandal would completely destroy the congregation's holy reputation. He adjusted the cuffs of his wrinkled silk shirt, sneering that my threats meant absolutely nothing because he was invincible within his family structure. He turned around, pulling the heavy oak door open with a sharp, aggressive jerk. He promised he would ruin my reputation tomorrow at the baby shower, completely convinced he had secured a major victory. He stormed out into the hallway, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a deafening thud. I stood entirely alone in the quiet foyer, the silence wrapping around me like a comforting heavy blanket. I felt absolutely neither anger nor threat. I slowly raised my left wrist and gently tapped the sleek glass screen of my smartwatch. The screen illuminated, displaying a bright red digital recording icon. I tapped the stop button, saving the crystal clear high-definition audio file directly to my secure encrypted server. The smartwatch had perfectly captured every single second of his violent extortion attempt, every single threat to destroy my medical spas, and his complete arrogant admission regarding his financial dominance over Geraldine. I walked over to my desk, opened my secure email portal, and attached the audio file. I typed out a brief, highly clinical message and forwarded the entire unedited recording directly to my lead corporate attorney. I immediately added the contact information for the state financial fraud department and the local police precinct, attaching the full forensic audit my team had completed just hours ago. The authorities now had undeniable proof of extortion, grand larceny, and elder abuse. Trevon thought his mother's blind loyalty was his ultimate shield, unaware that his own words had just sealed his ruin. I closed my laptop, finished my glass of wine, and smiled at the glittering city lights. Saturday morning broke with brilliant cloudless blue skies over the city of Atlanta. I woke up feeling an unprecedented level of calm clarity. The time for quietly absorbing insults and financing the delusions of a profoundly toxic family had officially expired. I spent the morning preparing myself with the meticulous precision of a general dressing for battle. I selected a custom-tailored stark white designer jumpsuit that radiated an untouchable clinical authority. I paired it with diamond stud earrings and a pair of razor-sharp stilettos. I did not need flashy, oversized logos to broadcast my financial status. True power does not need to shout. I stepped into the back of my private chauffeured car and directed my driver toward the Buckhead estate. The trap I had carefully laid over the past few weeks was primed and ready to snap shut. As my car turned onto the prestigious tree-lined street leading to my property, the sheer audacious scale of Geraldine's vanity project came into full view. The street was completely choked with luxury vehicles. An entire team of hired valets in matching uniforms was sprinting back and forth, desperately trying to manage the chaotic influx of high society guests. Geraldine and Kendra had clearly spared absolutely no expense, or rather they had spared absolutely none of Darren's fraudulently borrowed money. A massive archway of imported white roses and orchids spanned the heavy wrought iron gates of the driveway. A massive catered champagne tower sparkled under the midday sun, right on the front lawn. The delicate classical notes of a live string quartet drifted through the warm air, attempting to lend an aura of sophisticated elegance to an event entirely funded by a criminal Ponzi scheme. I directed my driver to bypass the frantic valets and pulled directly up to the edge of the manicured lawn. I looked out the tinted window and observed the spectacle unfolding on my property. The guest list was a meticulously curated collection of Atlanta's black elite. Women in massive designer hats and vibrant silk dresses mingled near the extravagant floral displays. I immediately spotted the mayor's wife holding a crystal flute of imported champagne, nodding politely as she listened to someone speak. Prominent local politicians, highly influential business owners, and the senior administrative officials from First Fellowship Cathedral were all present, laughing and admiring the sprawling grounds. The sheer audacity of hosting this fraudulent masquerade on my legally owned property was staggering. They were desperately attempting to cement their fake legacy in front of the entire city. At the absolute center of this ridiculous circus stood Geraldine. She was wearing an obnoxiously loud, wide-brimmed hat and a sequined dress that caught the sunlight with every movement. She was firmly holding court near the cascading champagne tower, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy, influential wives. She was projecting her voice so loudly that I could hear her from the driveway. She was brazenly bragging about her two supposedly brilliant, highly successful sons. She gestured wildly with her hands, boasting to the mayor's wife about Darren's elite banking career and Traven's massive venture capital firm. She spun a fantastical web of lies, loudly claiming that her sons had completely financed this $100,000 baby shower to honor the family's immaculate, blessed lineage. She soaked up the impressed nods and polite applause from the high society women, completely intoxicated by her own manufactured superiority. A few feet away from Geraldine, Kendra was aggressively parading around the patio. She was wearing a skin-tight maternity gown clearly meant to draw every single eyeball in the immediate vicinity. She balanced a tiny plate of imported caviar in one hand and waved to the guests with the other. She loudly commanded the catering staff to refill the champagne flutes, barking orders as if she were the rightful queen of the manor. I noticed how cleverly they had arranged the outdoor event. They positioned the massive floral walls and the string quartet directly in front of the grand bay windows to obscure the fact that the inside of the mansion was completely stripped bare. They were terrified someone might look through the glass and realize the so-called family estate was an entirely empty, barren shell. My driver smoothly opened the heavy car door for me. I stepped out onto the pristine paving stones, adjusting the cuffs of my crisp white jumpsuit. The sharp click of my stilettos against the driveway immediately caught the attention of the nearest valets. They froze, recognizing me instantly as the true owner of the property. I did not say a word to them. I simply walked forward, bypassing the welcome table covered in expensive personalized party favors. I moved with slow, deliberate grace, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable wealth and total control. As I glided past the perimeter of the floral arches, the atmospheric dynamic of the party began to shift. Conversations nearest to me abruptly stopped. Heads began to turn one by one as I moved deeper into the crowd. The influential guests, many of whom I knew personally through my highly successful medical spa franchise, immediately recognized me. They smiled and offered polite nods of respect, parting seamlessly to allow me passage through the crowded lawn. The hushed whispers started rippling outward like a shockwave. They were confused as to why the woman Geraldine had spent weeks publicly dragging through the mud was suddenly attending the family baby shower looking like a multimillionaire. I offered warm, completely relaxed smiles to the church elders and the politicians, projecting nothing but serene confidence as I cut a direct path straight toward the center of the extravagant event. It took exactly 45 seconds for Geraldine to realize the atmosphere of her precious party had drastically altered. She noticed the guests looking over her shoulder. She stopped mid-sentence, her smile faltering, as she turned her head to see what was causing the sudden drop in conversation. Her eyes locked onto my white jumpsuit. The glass of champagne in her hand trembled violently. The smug, self-satisfied glow on her face evaporated in a microsecond, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic and venomous rage. She excused herself from the mayor's wife with a harsh, choked gasp and practically lunged across the patio to intercept my path before I could reach the central gathering area. Geraldine stepped aggressively directly into my path, completely blocking my way to the main patio. Her face was flushed a dark, angry crimson, and a vein pulsed erratically in her neck. She leaned in incredibly close, desperate to keep her voice down so the surrounding high society guests could not hear her, completely losing her mind. Her eyes burned with absolute hatred. She hissed at me through gritted teeth, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, crashing her sacred family event. She aggressively commanded me to turn around and walk back to my car immediately. She stated that I was nothing but a jealous, pathetic failure, trying to ruin her family's moment of supreme glory. I stood my ground, my expression entirely calm and politely bored, Geraldine leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper filled with absolute malice. She told me that if I did not leave this instant, she would signal the private security team to drag me off the grass and physically throw me out into the street. She sneered, her lips curling into a cruel, ugly smile. She whispered that I was nothing but a barren, useless outcast. She stated that I was a broken woman who could not give her son an heir, and therefore I had absolutely no right to ever step foot inside her powerful family's estate. She explicitly told me that I did not belong here and that I was completely erased from their elite world forever. I looked down at her furious, sweating face. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of hurt. I did not let her cruel, toxic words penetrate my armor. I simply smiled, a slow, chilling expression that made her instinctively take a half step backward. I looked her dead in the eye and quietly stated that she was severely confused about who actually belonged on this property. Without waiting for her to process my words, I smoothly and effortlessly sidestepped her rigid body. I glided right past her, completely ignoring her frantic, whispered demands to come back. I walked with absolute purpose directly toward the small elevated stage where the string quartet was currently playing a classical symphony. Kendra spotted me approaching the stage. She dropped her plate of caviar, her mouth falling open in horror. Darren, who had been hiding near the catering tent, turned a sickly shade of gray and froze completely solid. I stepped up onto the low wooden stage, my white suit gleaming under the bright afternoon sun. I walked straight past the furious cellist and approached the central microphone that had been set up for the celebratory family toasts. I reached out and firmly grasped the microphone stand. I turned to the musicians and gave them a sharp, authoritative glare. The lead violinist faltered, lowering his bow. The music cut off abruptly with a harsh, discordant screech. The sudden, jarring silence was absolutely deafening. The gentle murmur of polite conversation among the 100 guests instantly died. Every single person on the lawn, the politicians, the wealthy wives, the church elders, stopped what they were doing and turned to face the stage. The clinking of champagne glasses ceased entirely. The entire opulent manufactured world Geraldine had built froze in place. I stood at the microphone, looking out over the sea of bewildered faces. I saw Geraldine hyperventilating near the front row, clutching her chest. I saw Trayvon glaring at me with pure murderous intent from the back patio. I commanded the absolute attention of every single influential person in the city of Atlanta. The words I was about to speak would hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. I could see the mayor's wife leaning over to whisper frantically to the head of the church committee. The facade of the wealthy, established Addams family legacy was instantly fracturing right in front of their eyes. Darren took a step back, trying to physically merge with the catering tent to avoid the collective burning gaze of his former friends and colleagues. Kendra let out a small, involuntary whimpering sound, clutching her expensive maternity dress as she stared at me in total horror. Geraldine looked like she was about to completely collapse onto the perfectly cut grass. They had spent weeks telling this exact group of people that I was a destitute, abandoned woman who was violently banished from their grand kingdom. Now I was standing on a stage, flawlessly dressed, claiming ownership of the very ground they stood on. I kept my eyes locked on Kendra's terrified face. I tapped the microphone twice. "Thank you all for coming to my property today," I announced clearly. "As the legal owner of this estate, I have a very special gift for the expectant mother." I casually reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a rolled-up legal document. I unfolded the thick legal document with slow, deliberate precision. The crisp sound of the heavy paper echoed sharply across the completely silent lawn. I held it up for the entire crowd to clearly see. "This is a 60-day notice to vacate for non-payment of rent, followed by an immediate writ of possession," I announced, my voice carrying effortlessly over the stunned audience. I walked down the short wooden steps, approached the lavish gift table covered in expensive silk, and dropped the papers right on top of a massive pile of carefully wrapped baby shower presents here today. The collective gasp from the elite crowd sounded like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the atmosphere. Influential guests exchanged completely horrified glances, their champagne flutes frozen midair. Geraldine let out an absolutely blood-curdling shriek that pierced the tense silence. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at the gift table, her eyes bulging with unadulterated panic. She spun around wildly, her sequined dress flashing in the sunlight, and locked her furious gaze directly onto Darren. She aggressively marched toward him, demanding he step forward and instantly fix this outrageous, humiliating lie in front of everyone here today. "Tell them she is crazy!" Geraldine screamed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation as she grabbed Darren by his tailored lapels. "Tell these people right now that you own this estate. Tell them you are a top-tier executive and this woman is just a delusional, jealous liar." She shook him violently, expecting her eldest son to summon his usual arrogant charm to defuse the catastrophic situation. Instead, Darren just stood there. He was sweating profusely, his face drained of all color, and his hands were visibly trembling as he looked out at his completely shocked former banking colleagues today. The facade finally shattered completely. Darren broke down right in front of the entire high society crowd. His broad shoulders slumped forward and a pathetic choking sob escaped his throat. "It is true, Ma," he whimpered, refusing to make eye contact with the mayor or the church elders who were watching him with absolute disgust. He wiped his sweating forehead with a trembling hand, his voice echoing pathetically across the pristine patio. "I do not own the house." He confessed the humiliating truth, finally tumbling out of him in a rush of panicked, breathless words right here with us today. "Sasha bought it to save me from foreclosure." Darren admitted, his voice cracking as he pointed weakly in my direction. The guests began whispering furiously to one another, the scandal too juicy to contain. "I am completely broke, Ma. I have absolutely nothing left. I am suspended from the bank pending a massive federal fraud investigation. My accounts are frozen, the cars are leased, the art is fake, everything is gone." He buried his face in his hands, crying loudly like a disciplined child right in the middle of the extravagant $100,000 fake baby shower event here today. Geraldine stood absolutely paralyzed for 3 agonizing seconds as the full weight of Darren's confession crushed her manufactured reality. Her precious, perfect narrative was burning to ash right in front of her most elite friends. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, hideous rage. Without warning, she raised her hand and viciously slapped Darren squarely across the face. The sharp, violent smack echoed loudly across the patio. The crowd gasped again, several women physically recoiling from the sudden display of raw physical violence. Darren stumbled backward, holding his rapidly reddening cheek, looking entirely stunned by her physical assault today. "You are absolutely useless!" Geraldine shrieked at him, completely abandoning any remaining shred of sophisticated decorum. She glared at Darren with pure, unfiltered disgust, viewing him no longer as a son, but as a defective asset that had publicly humiliated her. She immediately turned her back on him and began running across the manicured grass directly toward Trevon. Trevon was standing near the back of the catering tent, trying desperately to blend into the shadows. Geraldine lunged at him, wrapping her arms around her golden child, clutching his wrinkled silk shirt like a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline right now. "Tell them it is a lie, Trevon!" Geraldine begged loudly, her voice shrill with frantic, unchecked panic. "Tell these people you will buy the house right now with your venture capital. Show them we do not need this wretched woman or her money." She squeezed his arm, her eyes pleading for him to deploy his immense wealth and save their social standing. She desperately needed her youngest son to perform a miracle, completely unaware of the devastating audio recording sitting securely in my lawyer's inbox. She expected him to laugh, pull out a checkbook, and fix absolutely everything right away. Trevon did not move. He looked absolutely sick, his eyes darting frantically toward me, and then back to the horrified crowd. He tried to physically pry his mother's hands off his shirt, looking entirely desperate to escape her suffocating grip. He knew the truth. He knew the police and the fraud department were already mobilizing. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy wheeze emerged. He could not perform his usual arrogant swagger. He just stared at the ground, utterly defeated, unable to maintain the massive lie that had funded his entire fraudulent lifestyle right now today. "Traven, say something," Geraldine shrieked again, her panic escalating into pure, unfiltered terror as she watched her final hope crumble into nothing. She shook him, demanding a response, but Traven just violently shoved her hands away. He took 2 steps backward, creating distance between himself and the rapidly sinking ship of his mother's social empire. He refused to look at her, refused to comfort her, and absolutely refused to offer any financial salvation. The guests were now actively stepping away from the family, creating a wide circle of isolation around Geraldine, Darren, Trevon, and a panicked Kendra right here today. Kendra stood trembling near the champagne tower, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She looked frantically between her disgraced husband and her humiliated mother-in-law. The extravagant party she had planned to launch herself into the upper echelon of Atlanta society had transformed into a complete, unmitigated disaster. The string quartet had already quietly packed their instruments and slipped away. The catering staff stood frozen, unsure if they would even be paid for their services. I remained standing perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of their toxic legacy with a feeling of profound clinical complete satisfaction here today. Suddenly, the harsh, unmistakable reflection of bright red and blue police lights began flashing violently through the massive front bay windows of the estate. The rhythmic strobing colors bounced off the crystal champagne flutes and illuminated the terrified faces of the remaining guests. A deep, heavy silence fell over the lawn once again as everyone turned toward the grand entrance. The sound of heavy boots marching decisively across the marble foyer echoed loudly through the open patio doors. The authorities had arrived exactly on schedule, precisely executing the final phase of my perfectly orchestrated, highly devastating commercial trap here today. 2 heavily armed county sheriff deputies walked straight through the front door and stepped out onto the patio. They looked imposing and completely uninterested in the high society wealth surrounding them. They both held thick official clipboards, packed with verified legal documents. The senior deputy adjusted his utility belt and looked out over the crowd of silent, staring guests. He raised his clipboard, his voice booming with unquestionable legal authority. He announced to the entire patio that they were executing an immediate writ of possession on behalf of the property owner, effectively seizing control of the estate right here today. "The property must be vacated immediately," the deputy commanded, his stern voice cutting through the last remnants of Geraldine's shattered reality. He stated clearly that anyone not listed as the legal owner had exactly 10 minutes to exit the premises or face immediate arrest for criminal trespassing. He pointed a firm finger toward the driveway, indicating the path of exit. The elite guests did not need to be told twice. They immediately began surging toward the gates, abandoning their expensive party favors and half-empty plates of caviar, desperate to flee the humiliating scene before the arrest began right today. Geraldine collapsed onto her knees right on the manicured grass, wailing loudly as her entire world burned completely down to the ground. Darren continued weeping pathetically into his hands, entirely broken. Traven slowly backed away, realizing the sheriffs were likely here for much more than just a simple eviction today. Kendra stood completely paralyzed, surrounded by the physical ruins of her fraudulent baby shower. I simply adjusted my white blazer, feeling the warm Atlanta sun on my face. The absolute total destruction was finally complete, and I turned to walk gracefully back toward my waiting car, right now here today. I had taken exactly 2 steps toward the driveway when the senior deputy's voice cracked through the chaotic atmosphere again. He ordered the remaining guests to step aside, immediately motioning for his partner to begin securing the perimeter of the mansion. The sheer indignity of armed law enforcement treating their elite gathering like a common crime scene finally snapped Trevon out of his cowardly stupor. He simply could not stand the sight of the city's wealthiest power brokers watching him lose his kingdom without putting up a pathetic fight. Trevon shoved past a frantic caterer and marched directly up to the deputies. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to inflate his physical presence to match his rapidly inflating ego. He pointed a shaking manicured finger at the senior sheriff, yelling at the top of his lungs that he was a highly successful venture capital millionaire. He screamed that they had absolutely no right to disrupt a private elite function. He threatened to call the governor, the police commissioner, and a massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers. He swore he would personally sue both deputies for every single penny they owned and have their badges permanently stripped by Monday morning. The senior deputy did not even blink. He simply placed a heavy hand on his utility belt and calmly advised Trayvon to step back immediately before he added a felony charge for assaulting a peace officer to the eviction notice. Trayvon vehemently refused to back down. He continued to yell wildly, gesturing toward the mansion, loudly proclaiming his immense untouchable wealth and his absolute dominance over the entire Atlanta business district. He was completely delusional, desperately clinging to a fabricated reality that was already turning to ash. He demanded the sheriffs respect his ultimate authority and leave his massive property immediately. He genuinely believed that his fake prestige could magically override the brutal, undeniable truth of the law right now. His pathetic tantrum was an absolute spectacle of sheer, unadulterated entitlement and total, complete denial. He looked like an absolute fool standing on the bright green grass today, right now, screaming at the silent officers. I stopped walking and slowly turned back around to face the patio. I could not let Trayvon peddle his arrogant, fabricated delusions to the police and the lingering guests for another second. I reached into the pocket of my designer blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I swiftly opened my settings and navigated to the Bluetooth menu. The expensive state-of-the-art sound system used for the string quartet and the toasts was still completely active, waiting for a paired device. I selected the mansion's central audio network. It connected instantly with a sharp, resonant chime that echoed across the lawn. Trayvon was still screaming at the deputies about his massive investment portfolio and his limitless bank accounts. I held my phone up, making sure he could clearly see the illuminated screen. "Before you write that check, Trayvon." I projected my voice clearly over his unhinged shouting. "Maybe you should explain this to your mother." I pressed play on the high-definition audio file I had captured yesterday in my penthouse foyer. The crystal-clear recording of Trevon's desperate, panicked voice blasted out of the massive outdoor speakers. Every single person on the lawn heard him screaming about his fake venture capital firm. They heard him explicitly admit that he was entirely broke and drowning in insurmountable debt. They heard the undeniable, sickening moment when he confessed to forging power of attorney documents. They heard him proudly, maliciously boast that he had completely drained Geraldine's entire retirement fund just to pay off his massive illegal gambling debts and fund his luxury car leases. The audio echoed relentlessly off the stone walls of the mansion, broadcasting his absolute moral bankruptcy to the entire neighborhood. He stood completely frozen as his own voice condemned him. He could not deny the horrible truth ringing in his ears. His ultimate, devastating destruction was completely broadcasted for the entire world to hear right now. The fake millionaire was entirely exposed, utterly ruined, and completely trapped by his very own cruel, arrogant words today. He shrank under the horrified crowd. Geraldine let out a sound that was not human. It was a visceral, guttural howl of absolute devastation. She staggered backward as if she had been physically shot in the chest. Her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed heavily into a white wrought-iron patio chair. She clutched her head, wailing loudly, her extravagant hat falling onto the grass. The stark, horrific realization that she was completely penniless washed over her face. Her precious golden boy had not just failed her. He had systematically robbed her blind, betrayed her absolute trust, and left her totally destitute in her old age. She gasped for air, staring at Trayvon with absolute horrified recognition of the monster she had raised and relentlessly enabled. Kendra reacted entirely differently. The exact moment she realized the immense fortune she had married into was nothing but a mirage built on stolen retirement funds, her panic morphed instantly into violent, uncontrollable rage. Kendra lunged across the patio and viciously attacked Trayvon. She grabbed the collar of his expensive silk shirt, shaking him furiously. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her refined, high society persona. She slapped his chest repeatedly, shrieking that he was a broke, pathetic loser. She wailed that she had wasted her youth and ruined her body for a man who could not even afford a basic apartment. She cursed him for lying to her, for promising her a life of unimaginable luxury that simply did not exist. She clawed at his jacket, demanding to know how she was supposed to raise a child with a destitute fraud facing federal prison time. She was completely unhinged. She hit his chest over and over again, entirely consumed by her own massive, devastating financial loss. Her desperate, calculated plan to secure a massive fortune had spectacularly backfired, leaving her violently attacking the broke man she had falsely idolized. She screamed that she would literally kill him for completely destroying her entire life right now today before everyone here sobbing hysterically into the bright, warm air. Trayvon violently shoved Kendra away from him, his face contorted into a mask of pure ugly fury. He stumbled backward, his carefully crafted charm entirely replaced by venomous hatred. He fired back at her, instantly screaming at the top of his lungs. He called her a pathetic, money-hungry gold digger who only cared about his wallet. He yelled that she was nothing but a highly calculating leech who had intentionally trapped him with a pregnancy just to secure a permanent spot in his wealthy lifestyle. He sneered at her, declaring she was completely useless to him now that the money was gone. The ugly, vicious truth of their transactional, completely toxic marriage was laid bare for the entire city to witness. They stood screaming at each other on the lawn, tearing each other apart like wild animals fighting over scraps. I decided to deliver the final, absolute killing blow. I tapped the screen of my phone one last time and selected the second audio file. The recording from the marble restroom at Phipps Plaza began to play through the massive sound system. Kendra's frantic, hyperventilating voice echoed clearly through the mansion grounds. "My real baby daddy is going to expose us for child support," the recorded voice shrieked loudly into the bright afternoon air. The recording continued playing loudly, revealing her absolute panic about the true paternity of the child, and her desperate calculating need to secure Trayvon's fake fortune before the awful truth leaked out. The loud, violent argument between Trayvon and Kendra instantly ceased entirely without another sound. The silence that fell over the estate was heavier, colder, and more suffocating than ever before. Trayvon slowly lowered his arms. His face went entirely slack, draining of all blood and color in a fraction of a second. He turned his head mechanically, his eyes dropping slowly from Kendra's horrified frozen face down to her perfectly rounded pregnant belly. He stared at her stomach in absolute, unadulterated horror, the devastating reality of his ultimate humiliation finally taking deep, permanent root in his shattered mind. His legacy was dead. He fully realized he had stolen his mother's entire life savings to fund a fraudulent lifestyle for a woman who was carrying another man's child. His entire world was utterly annihilated, completely demolished by his own sheer, unmitigated, spectacular arrogance. He stood paralyzed on the grass, unable to speak, breathe, or move, as the crushing weight of his absolute failure destroyed him. The elite guests whispered in absolute shock, recording his total destruction on their phones as the officers watched. The ultimate revenge was perfectly executed today. I smiled to myself today as I gracefully walked away from the wreckage of their lives, feeling finally free and fully at peace. I turned to walk gracefully back toward my waiting car right now here today. However, the senior sheriff abruptly raised his heavy voice again, ordering the panicked guests to immediately step aside and clear a direct path. The sheer indignity of armed law enforcement treating their elite gathering like a common crime scene finally snapped Trayvon out of his cowardly stupor. He simply could not stand the sight of the city's wealthiest power brokers watching him lose his kingdom without putting up a fight. Trayvon shoved past a frantic caterer and marched directly up to the deputies. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to inflate his physical presence to match his rapidly inflating ego. He pointed a shaking manicured finger at the senior sheriff, yelling at the top of his lungs that he was a highly successful venture capital millionaire. He screamed that they had absolutely no right to disrupt a private elite function. He threatened to call the governor, the police commissioner, and a massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers. He swore he would personally sue both deputies for every single penny they owned and have their badges permanently stripped by Monday morning. The senior deputy did not even blink. He simply placed a heavy hand on his utility belt and calmly advised Trayvon to step back immediately before he added a felony charge for assaulting a peace officer to the eviction notice. Trayvon vehemently refused to back down. He continued to yell wildly, gesturing toward the mansion, loudly proclaiming his immense, untouchable wealth and his absolute dominance over the entire Atlanta business district. He was completely delusional, desperately clinging to a fabricated reality that was already turning to ash. He demanded the sheriffs respect his ultimate authority and leave his massive property immediately. He genuinely believed that his fake prestige could magically override the brutal, undeniable truth of the law right now. His pathetic tantrum was an absolute spectacle of sheer, unadulterated entitlement and total, complete denial. He looked like an absolute fool standing on the bright green grass, screaming at the silent officers. I stopped walking and slowly turned back around to face the patio. I could not let Trayvon peddle his arrogant, fabricated delusions to the police and the lingering guests for another second. I reached into the pocket of my designer blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I swiftly opened my settings and navigated to the Bluetooth menu. The expensive state-of-the-art sound system used for the party was still completely active, waiting for a paired device. I selected the mansion's central audio network. It connected instantly with a sharp, resonant chime that echoed across the lawn. Trayvon was still screaming at the deputies about his massive investment portfolio and his limitless bank accounts. I held my phone up, making sure he could clearly see the illuminated screen. "Before you write that check, Trayvon," I projected my voice clearly over his unhinged shouting, "maybe you should explain this to your mother." I pressed play on the high-definition audio file I had captured yesterday in my penthouse foyer. The crystal-clear recording of Trayvon's desperate, panicked voice blasted out of the massive outdoor speakers. Every single person on the lawn heard him screaming about his fake venture capital firm. They heard him explicitly admit that he was entirely broke and drowning in insurmountable debt. They heard the undeniable, sickening moment when he confessed to forging power of attorney documents. They heard him proudly, maliciously boast that he had completely drained Geraldine's entire retirement fund just to pay off his massive illegal gambling debts and fund his luxury car leases. The audio echoed relentlessly off the stone walls of the mansion, broadcasting his absolute moral bankruptcy to the entire neighborhood. He stood completely frozen as his own voice condemned him. He could not deny the horrible truth ringing in his ears. His ultimate devastating destruction was completely broadcasted for the entire world to hear right now. The fake millionaire was entirely exposed, utterly ruined, and completely trapped by his very own cruel, arrogant words today. He shrank under the horrified crowd. Geraldine let out a sound that was not human. It was a visceral, guttural howl of absolute devastation. She staggered backward as if she had been physically shot in the chest. Her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed heavily into a white wrought iron patio chair. She clutched her head, wailing loudly, her extravagant hat falling onto the grass. The stark, horrific realization that she was completely penniless washed over her face. Her precious golden boy had not just failed her. He had systematically robbed her blind, betrayed her absolute trust, and left her totally destitute in her old age. She gasped for air, staring at Trayvon with absolute horrified recognition of the monster she had raised and relentlessly enabled. Kendra reacted entirely differently. The exact moment she realized the immense fortune she had married into was nothing but a mirage built on stolen retirement funds, her panic morphed instantly into violent, uncontrollable rage. Kendra lunged across the patio and viciously attacked Trayvon. She grabbed the collar of his expensive silk shirt, shaking him furiously. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her refined high society persona. She slapped his chest repeatedly, shrieking that he was a broke, pathetic loser. She wailed that she had wasted her youth and ruined her body for a man who could not even afford a basic apartment. She cursed him for lying to her, for promising her a life of unimaginable luxury that simply did not exist. She clawed at his jacket, demanding to know how she was supposed to raise a child with a destitute fraud facing federal prison time. She was completely unhinged. She hit his chest over and over again, entirely consumed by her own massive, devastating financial loss. Her desperate, calculated plan to secure a massive fortune had spectacularly backfired, leaving her violently attacking the broke man she had falsely idolized. She screamed that she would literally kill him for completely destroying her entire life right now today, before everyone here sobbing hysterically into the bright, warm air. Trayvon violently shoved Kendra away from him, his face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly fury. He stumbled backward, his carefully crafted charm entirely replaced by venomous hatred. He fired back at her, instantly screaming at the top of his lungs. He called her a pathetic, money-hungry gold digger who only cared about his wallet. He yelled that she was nothing but a highly calculating leech who had intentionally trapped him with a pregnancy just to secure a permanent spot in his wealthy lifestyle. He sneered at her, declaring she was completely useless to him now that the money was gone. The ugly, vicious truth of their transactional, completely toxic marriage was laid bare for the entire city to witness. They stood screaming at each other on the lawn, tearing each other apart like wild animals fighting over scraps. I decided to deliver the final, absolute killing blow. I tapped the screen of my phone one last time and selected the second audio file. The recording from the marble restroom at Phipps Plaza began to play through the massive sound system. Kendra's frantic, hyperventilating voice echoed clearly through the mansion grounds. "My real baby daddy is going to expose us for child support," the recorded voice shrieked loudly into the bright afternoon air. The recording continued playing, loudly revealing her absolute panic about the true paternity of the child and her desperate, calculating need to secure Trayvon's fake fortune before the awful truth leaked out. The loud, violent argument between Trayvon and Kendra instantly ceased entirely without another sound. The silence that fell over the estate was heavier, colder, and more suffocating than ever before. Trayvon slowly lowered his arms. His face went entirely slack, draining of all blood and color in a fraction of a second. He turned his head mechanically, his eyes dropping slowly from Kendra's horrified, frozen face down to her perfectly rounded, pregnant belly. He stared at her stomach in absolute, unadulterated horror, the devastating reality of his ultimate humiliation finally taking deep, permanent root in his shattered mind. His legacy was dead. He fully realized he had stolen his mother's entire life savings to fund a fraudulent lifestyle for a woman who was carrying another man's child. His entire world was utterly annihilated, completely demolished by his own sheer, unmitigated, spectacular arrogance. He stood paralyzed on the grass, unable to speak, breathe, or move, as the crushing weight of his absolute failure destroyed him. The elite guests whispered in absolute shock, recording his total destruction on their phones as the officers watched. The ultimate revenge was perfectly executed today. I smiled to myself today, as I gracefully walked away from the wreckage of their lives, feeling finally free and fully at peace right now, with my spirit soaring toward absolute, enduring, boundless, eternal freedom. 6 short months passed quickly since that spectacular afternoon. The total devastation of the Addams family was not just a fleeting social scandal. It became a permanent, inescapable reality. Trayvon, the arrogant golden child who foolishly believed his fabricated venture capital firm made him entirely invincible, was currently serving a rigorous 10-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and financial embezzlement. The authorities had swiftly uncovered his elaborate criminal scheme, ruthlessly stripping him of his luxury sports cars, his fake designer watches, and every single cent he had fraudulently obtained. He traded his tailored Italian silk suits for a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit, locked away permanently in a tiny concrete cell where his manipulative charm held absolutely zero valuable currency. Darren experienced an equally steep and unforgiving fall from grace. His prestigious banking career evaporated the moment the federal investigators froze his accounts and exposed his complicity in the massive financial deception. He avoided prison by turning state's evidence against his brother, but the resulting plea deal left him entirely destitute and permanently blacklisted from the corporate financial sector. He now worked 40 hours a week as a drive-through cashier at a greasy, brightly lit fast food restaurant on the absolute outskirts of the city. He spent his days wearing a polyester uniform, handing greasy paper bags through a sliding glass window to customers who never looked him in the eye. He lived in a cramped, deeply depressing motel room off the interstate, his walls stained with mildew and his nights filled with the deafening roar of passing semi-trucks. He had absolutely nothing left of the arrogant, entitled banker who had once treated my ambition as a mere joke. The most poetic justice, however, belonged entirely to Geraldine. Stripped of her immense pride, her stolen retirement funds, her high-ranking church standing, and her favorite son, she was completely ruined. She had no choice but to move into Kendra's cramped two-bedroom apartment on the notoriously rough south side of Atlanta. The two women who had once bonded over their shared hatred of me were now permanently trapped together in a suffocating prison of mutual resentment and abject poverty. Geraldine spent her days raising a baby that did not carry a single drop of Adam's blood, changing diapers in a tiny, unair-conditioned room, while Kendra worked double shifts at a discount retail store just to keep the lights on. Geraldine was finally living the exact, miserable, destitute life she had so maliciously wished upon me. While they drowned rapidly in the toxic consequences of their own actions, my life expanded into something truly magnificent. My divorce from Darren was finalized with a swift, merciless efficiency that left him completely empty-handed. Because his massive financial fraud explicitly violated the core terms of our marriage, and because he had actively attempted to hide his illicit debts by forging my signature on secondary accounts, the judge completely invalidated any marital claims he desperately tried to make on my businesses. I retained absolute 100% legal ownership of my thriving assets, my medical spa franchise, and my massive personal savings. The presiding judge did not award him a single penny of alimony, noting his extensive criminal activities and his deliberate financial sabotage. Darren sat silently in the quiet courtroom, looking pale and defeated, wearing an ill-fitting suit, as the heavy wooden gavel slammed down and permanently severed my last remaining legal tie to his deeply toxic family. I walked out of that specific courthouse feeling an overwhelming sense of true liberation, completely unburdened by the parasitic weight I had carried for years. My medical spa business exploded in profitability during those 6 transformative months. Without Darren draining my accounts or Geraldine attempting to sabotage my self-esteem, I channeled every ounce of my energy into expanding my brand. I opened 2 new locations in prime commercial districts, hired elite teams of medical professionals, and secured highly lucrative partnerships with top-tier cosmetic brands. My name became entirely synonymous with ultimate luxury, comprehensive wellness, and unshakable female empowerment across the entire city of Atlanta. My loyal clientele grew exponentially, bringing in record-breaking revenue that firmly solidified my status as one of the most successful independent entrepreneurs in the state. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating wife shrinking in the background of hostile family dinners. I was a fierce powerhouse, fully realizing the massive professional potential I had always possessed. Tonight was the ultimate culmination of that hard-won success. The warm night air hummed with an electric energy as a massive, highly exclusive gala was being held to celebrate the grand opening of my newest flagship location. I sat in the plush leather back seat of my sleek custom black Maybach, watching the bright city lights blur past the tinted windows. My chauffeur smoothly navigated the busy streets, heading directly toward the most prestigious neighborhood in Atlanta. I smoothed my hands over my dress, It was a stunning custom-made floor-length emerald gown that hugged my curves perfectly, dripping with thousands of hand-sewn crystals that caught the light with every movement. I wore a delicate diamond necklace that rested elegantly against my collarbone, an extravagant gift I had happily purchased for myself to celebrate my newfound freedom. The Maybach slowed to a graceful stop at the edge of a massive red carpet. A uniformed attendant instantly stepped forward and opened the heavy car door. I stepped out into the warm evening air, and the night immediately erupted in a blinding storm of bright flashing lights. Dozens of professional photographers and high society reporters loudly shouted my full name, their expensive cameras perfectly capturing my triumphant arrival. A massive crowd of influential guests, local politicians, and wealthy elite lined the red carpet, applauding enthusiastically as I walked past. They looked at me with genuine respect and deep admiration. I smiled warmly, waving to the cameras, feeling entirely comfortable in the bright spotlight I had rightfully earned. I was not hiding in the shadows of arrogant men or seeking validation from toxic women. I was standing firmly in my own immense power. At the end of the red carpet, an enormous silk ribbon stretched across the grand entrance of my new flagship spa. A pair of oversized golden scissors waited on a velvet cushion. I took the scissors, looking out at the cheering crowd, and sliced cleanly through the thick ribbon. The audience erupted in massive applause, raising their champagne flutes high into the air. The grand double doors swung open, revealing the breathtaking, opulent interior of the most luxurious medical spa facility in the entire Southeast. But this was not just any standard commercial building. This specific piece of real estate held a deeply personal, incredibly profound significance. The cameras panned back, capturing the massive, sprawling exterior of the property. The grand architectural columns, the sprawling manicured lawns, and the towering bay windows were instantly recognizable to every single person standing in attendance at the glorious event. I had completely gutted, aggressively remodeled, and entirely transformed the old Addams family estate in Buckhead. The very same mansion where Geraldine had spent years holding court and brutally mocking my existence was now the undisputed crown jewel of my rapidly expanding medical business empire. I walked proudly through the grand front doors and stepped into the main lobby. Where Geraldine's stuffy, pretentious dining table once sat, there was now a massive, state-of-the-art reception desk, crafted from imported white marble. Mounted securely on the wall behind the desk, glowing brightly in elegant gold letters, was my own name. The sterile, empty shell of a house that Darren and Trevon had nearly lost to foreclosure was now filled with vibrant life, soft ambient lighting, and the absolute pinnacle of modern luxury wellness. I accepted a crystal flute of imported premium champagne from a passing waiter and walked over to the base of the grand staircase. I slowly turned to face the massive crowd of guests flowing into the beautifully renovated mansion. I saw my loyal, hardworking staff smiling brightly at me. I saw genuine friends who had supported me during my lowest moments. I saw a room full of people who valued my actual character, not my bank account, or my perceived social utility, celebrating my absolute triumph. I raised my glass high, the crystals sparkling under the brilliant modern chandeliers that hung from the freshly painted ceiling. I looked out over my newly established empire, feeling the warm, undeniable, radiant glow of absolute and total victory spreading through my chest. I was entirely whole, incredibly wealthy, and permanently free from the dark, suffocating shadow of their toxic expectations. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of crisp champagne, letting the sweet taste of sweet revenge wash over me. The fraudulent Adams legacy was completely erased, permanently swept away into the garbage where it truly belonged. My flawless, brilliant legacy, however, was just beginning.